Hey everybody, welcome to Thinking Christian. In this video, what I want to do is talk about the simulation theory argument for the existence of God. This is a relatively new argument compared to some of the older ones, but it's gotten a lot of interesting attention recently, so I wanted to talk a little bit about it and give my version of the argument, my formulation, as well as another popular level version of it that you'll often see. So simulation theory is the idea that we live in a simulated reality, like that of a computer or the Matrix or something like that. Now, whether or not what we exist in is sort of the real world or is reality, that's an interesting question and one that's been explored a lot by simulation theorists. But the main argument is that if we do live in a simulation or a simulated reality, then there is more likely to be a God than not. This idea of simulation theory really got a lot of attention for the philosopher Nick Bostrom. He basically had this paper in 2003 where he argued that one of the following is probably true. One of the following three. So the first is the fraction of human-level civilizations capable of running high-fidelity ancestor simulations is very close to zero. So he basically says one option is basically what he calls post-human civilizations somehow end up destroying themselves before being able to simulate reality. Number two, the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running simulations of their evolutionary history or variations thereof is very close to zero. So that's the second option. Or number three, the fraction of all people with our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to one. And as a result, basically, he concludes that it is more likely that we live in a computer simulation than not. And I think if you think about this argument for a second and you think about the existence of God, it seems like, hey, maybe God seems more likely to exist if we do live in a simulated environment. This was a funny tweet. It was kind of a joke, I think. But atheists be like, we probably live in a computer simulation. Like, bro, you just believe in God, except you think he's a nerd. And that's a fair thing, right? Because if simulation theory is true, then it is more likely that there is a simulator with many godlike properties. And we'll look at this in a second. Now, David Chalmers has a version of this argument, and I should mention that David Chalmers is an atheist, but he has a version of this argument that rests on there being a creator, that simulation theory. It makes sense that there would be a creator in the simulation theory sense. He says in his book, Reality Plus, the simulation hypothesis has made me take the existence of a God more seriously than I ever had before. Whether he's still an atheist about this, I don't think he's an atheist because I think he takes this very seriously, and it definitely puts him in that evidential sort of category. He goes on to say, if the simulation argument is even approximately as good as the design argument, it deserves to be in the pantheon of arguments for God's existence. And he goes on to discuss arguments for God's existence in his book, Reality Plus. I do recommend the book, Reality Plus. I've met with Chalmers at an AI conference, and we had a really interesting conversation. And even though his book isn't really, I wouldn't recommend it for arguments for God's existence. For that reason, it does talk about a lot of really interesting philosophical issues when it comes to virtual worlds. And I think it's good for the type of level that most people who don't read a lot of technical analytic philosophy can read and get an appreciation for. It's a fun book. It has a lot of pop culture references, even though it does actually get pretty deep on some of these issues. It's just not a very technical book in the pejorative sense. So his version of the argument goes like this. Premise one, a few top-level populations will each create many populations. So this is the idea that it is possible to simulate reality. Premise two, if a few top-level populations each create many populations, then most intelligent beings are actually created. Most things are created. Premise three, if most intelligent beings are created, then we ourselves are probably created. And the conclusion, therefore, we are probably created. And you can say, therefore, there is more likely to be a godlike entity than not. Now, my version of the argument is slightly different, and I kind of thought up of this, differently and independently of Chalmers, but it was interesting seeing Chalmers' version of the argument. So my version of the argument goes like this. Premise one, either minds can be simulated or minds cannot be simulated. Premise two, if minds cannot be simulated, then God is more likely to exist than not to exist. And this is basically the idea. If we can't create simulations of our minds, then there is likely to be something like a soul that we were endowed by some sort of creator. If we cannot simulate our own minds in a computer, there's something about consciousness or basically being that cannot be simulated, then naturalism is likely false, is kind of my premise, and therefore God is more likely to exist. Now we go to premise three. This is taking the other horn and saying minds cannot be simulated. If minds can be simulated, this is the second horn. If minds can be simulated, then it is more likely that we live in a computer simulation than not. This is where I would cite Bostrom's argument, where it's basically like there are all these times we can think of if minds can be simulated that we are in some sort of simulation or simulation-like environment. Premise 4, if we do live in a simulation, then it is more likely an entity like God needs to exist, which would be the simulator or the thing creating the simulation or overseeing the simulation or sustaining the simulation. You can call this the simulator. And then conclusion would be taking the result of both of these horns together, therefore it is more likely that God exists than God doesn't exist. So this is basically trying to show, regardless of whether or not our minds can be simulated, the result of either one is that God is more likely to exist. So an interesting argument. This is sort of how I would phrase it. Now, there are a couple qualifications that are important to make to this argument, because I don't think this argument... I don't want people going around and being like, oh my gosh, this proves the existence of God. The point is to make the existence of God seem much, much, much more likely. And I think this argument succeeds in at least making it more likely than before we had any knowledge of simulation theory or technology. But one of the things we need to make sure is we need to actually have a definition of what God is. So I think what this argument succeeds in doing is saying it is more probable than not that a God-like entity exists, something with creative powers. And there are 4 typical things we associate with God, at least in the Judeo-Christian sense, that I think are worth talking about. And they are, 1, God is the creator of the universe. 2, God is all-powerful, omnipotence. 3, God is all-knowing, omniscience. And 4, God is all-good, which this is omnibenevolence. I think the first 3 of these, the simulation theory succeeds in creating. Number 4, it does not. Chalmers says in his version of the argument, many simulators with access to the source code and data structures involved in their simulation will have near unlimited powers over the worlds they create. He argues that premise 1 obviously makes sense by definition. Premise 2, basically, if you are the one running the simulation, then you can obviously change things, have access, he says here in the source code, and be tweaking things around. Number 3, basically, if you are able to tweak things, you can also view variables, you can also look at things. If you're able to change them, it's very clear you would need to know what they are to know what you're changing. But number 4, I think you don't establish. So you don't establish God as this all good kind of thing. You would need other arguments for that particular thing. So that's where I say, look, simulation theory does not establish God as all good. Although then again, neither does necessarily the design arguments, fine-tuning arguments, or the cosmological arguments. So you would need other types of arguments if you're trying to get to specifically the Christian God, which is considered to be all good. So let's summarize, right? The simulation theory hypothesis basically offers a path to reconciliation, a God that a naturalist, even a naturalist, can believe in, which is a very odd thing to think about. So even if naturalism is true, there could still be a God that created the world that we live in. A weird thing to think about. Now, obviously, I'm not a naturalist, but I think this was one of the reasons Chalmers found this argument to be very interesting, because even a naturalist could believe that there is a God, a world above us in a specific way. And transhumanist philosopher David Pearce says, look, the simulation argument is the most interesting argument for the existence of God in a long time. There have been a lot of really interesting ones, but that one is very interesting that this is kind of getting some modern sorts of attention. And I think there's really an intuitive component to this too, right? Look, if we live inside a computer simulation, it makes sense that there would be a simulator or creator that is in charge of creating the simulation and sustaining it. And the point that I want to say is, look, if such a creator exists and has a mind and created our world for a specific reason, if we do live in a sort of simulated-like reality, then it is plausible that it would want to communicate the purpose to us, to other minds inside of the simulation, right? If that's its goal, if its goal is to create conscious or intelligent life, which most people who subscribe to the simulation theory argument would argue, then it doesn't seem implausible that such a creator would want to actually communicate with the people inside of it. So there are a lot of really interesting things you can talk about. Like I said, I don't necessarily believe one way or another that we live in a simulation. In fact, I tend to think we likely don't, but I'm open to the idea. But really, it doesn't really matter. It's just one way to explore these ideas. And I think simulation theory and what is becoming to be known now as simulation theology, which is the idea of understanding God through some ideas from simulation theory, computer science, these sorts of things, is a really interesting avenue for future philosophical and scientific discovery and discussion. So yeah, it's a really interesting field. So definitely check it out. I don't know many people who are doing this, but It's interesting to think about. So yeah, check it out. Thanks for watching. And if you're interested in some more readings on this, obviously check out Nick Bostrom's paper and also David Chalmers' work on Reality Plus, another really interesting book. I know I've talked about it here, Mind and Cosmos by Thomas Nagel. Also a very interesting book to read, although I don't think it really goes too far into simulation theory, but worth your time. All right, thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you find this argument compelling? Do you think we live in a simulation? Very interesting thing to think about. Have a good one.